Welcome to this lesson 9. We've written REST APIs and will now continue consuming REST APIs. For now, we'll focus on calling an API and retrieving a list and getting single documents, so the GET requests. Okay, so we will work with API response codes and validation. Okay. So working with Express and Node.js to interact with your API. Then we'll focus next. Adding the request module to your project. Setting up default options using request module. The request module is like any other packages, so it's an npm install again, right? And via npm. So npm install -- save request, so it should be added to your dependencies in package.json. You could search requests in Google, the npm library, to understand more functionalities about it. And whenever we want to use it, we would basically include it in our file. And we can use the correct URL depending on the environment. You can use it, your old friend node env environment variable. So if you do have a .env file, right, and you have a node_env there, you can have values, right? So we can create a variable called API options, wherein we have a server and we define the server to have a value of localhost, right? For localhost playground, right? Or development. But if we do see the node env with a string value of production, then we will basically interact with the server. We will basically reassign the value of the server to have the live URL, meaning the Heroku URL or wherever you hosted it. So the request module has two parameters, JavaScript object defining the request and the callback, so the function when a response is received. For common request options for defining a call to an API, you have URL, you have the method, and the JSON, the body, and query string if you need it, right? It's optional. Callback function runs when a response comes back from the API and has three parameters: error object, full response, and parse body of the response, right? Error object is null unless an error has been caught. Okay. So useful data, the status code of the response, the body of response, and any error thrown. So this is now dealing with the application server portion. So the application server, in the previous two lessons, the application server was requesting to the API server, right? Now, what we're dealing with is the side wherein the API server is responding to the application server. And now this is the code, or this is the view from the application server receiving a response, if there is any, right? So we'll start with having this anonymous function with error response body, right? A callback function. And then if we get any error, then we just log it out as an error. If we do get a status code of 200, right, and then that would basically let the application server know that, oh, we have gotten a successful request, right? Because we got a response code 200. If it's a yes, then we'll access the body, right? And then else, if we did not get 200 code, maybe a 404, then we'll log that out for the application server, right? Like 404 again. So API calls, let's say you define your options, right? So your request option, let's say you have this API path, and the method you want to do is maybe a get or post, right? It's a get, so that's why the JSON is empty. We're not submitting any data. We're asking for data or resource. And the query string offset, again, that's optional. And after you have that request option, we define that variable. That's for just ease of reuse. We can now use the request module, and then just pass in the request option, so it's more easier to read, or decoupled, or not decoupled really, but it's better structured, right? And then the second parameter is your error response and body, right? Get any error, show the error, get the 200 status code, then access the body, right? If not, show the other status code. Okay, we separate concerns, moving rendering into a named function. We decouple the rendering from the application logic. Function becomes reusable and can be called from multiple places, and avoid deeply nested code, which is harder to maintain, right? So we now try to move the contents of controller to external function, right? So in the request response, let's see, home list controller, right? Rest.render, it will render the location list pug template, and with this title with the value string of locator, find a place to work with Wi-Fi, right? And this home list function, right, where it would render homepage, right? Okay. So to build the request, you need to know the URL, method, JSON body, and query string to send. Okay. And updating the controller to the call API before rendering the page. When you make the request, you'll pass through a simple callback function, call the render homepage function so that you don't leave the browser hanging. Okay, so the home list, you now first create a variable path and add that /API/location so that you can reuse that path as part of your request options, right? And this is basically your request option. Okay, URL method, query string, and then now you can use the request. The request option, the request requiring two parameters, right? And we added the request option and then the callback function. And instead of writing the code here, we basically created the render homepage function, right? We decoupled it. Okay. Assume that the response body is returned to the callback, and you can pass it straight to the render homepage function. Okay. So yep, you just called another function inside of the callback function. And then in your render homepage, you basically want to, we mentioned about this, render the location list pug template, and we want to change the locations, right? Instead of a hard-coded array of location, we want to use the response body, right, as part of it. Okay, so initial result would look as follow, right? It's closer to our desired result, and we just want to fix the distance computation, or how it's being rendered with this parse float, and to fix precision. Okay, and the mat floor, and also we want to have initialize a data array, and we want to do a map function from the body, right? So from the body, we would want to access each of the item inside the body, right? And each of the items distance, we want to format them, right? To again make it to have precision, because humans won't read like 9 decimal places, right? The most maybe 2 to 4 decimal places. Okay, so map is, that's what it's doing. It's basically altering the data and putting it back in, right? And it's not reducing or deleting. Okay. Next, so now for the distance, right? So let's go back. So we want to remove the unit from the API response, right? So results that map to access each of the result, And then we do want to return the name, result.name, the address with the result.address. And the last one is the distance. We want to return the result, the distance that calculated that to fix, right? So that would remove the M from what you're seeing, right? Okay, from no precision to an added precision, making the request callback more robust. One of the main reasons for catching errors is to make sure they don't cause code to fail. The first point of weakness is in the request callback, where you're manipulating the response before sending the data off to be rendered. This is fine if data is always consistent, but you don't have that luxury, right? Request callback currently runs a for loop to format the distance. No matter what data is returned by the API, you should run only this loop when you return a 200 code. That's why it's important for the API server to send back the correct response code, because what if, even though the location was not found, then it's still thrown a 200? Again, it would mess up the logic for other applications communicating with it, right? Okay. So validating the API, if it returns some data before using it, we added the ampersand, right? It's an end operator. So if the body has any data, we can know that for sure with body.len, right? Then we can format the distance, okay? Now defining output messages based on the response data. The response could be one of three things: an array of location, an empty array with no locations, a string containing an error message. Okay, you want the error message to be sent to the view as well so that the user knows, or the application knows. To do so, you need to update the render homepage function to also do the following. So we're doing more refactoring, okay? Set a variable container for a message. Check whether response body is an array. If not, send the message, right? Now we see the importance of sending errors and message all the time. Okay, we now improve our render homepage function. So let's first have a message null with a null value. If a response body is not an instance of array because of this exclamation point, then we can add a string called API lookup error, right? Else, if response body length is 0, then no places found nearby would be our message. So this helps the user know what exactly is wrong or missing, instead of just saying, hey, error, right? At least it would say, oh, API lookup error. Oh, it would say, oh, there's no error really in the API. There's just no places to be found, right? Okay, so we have the rest render, the location list pug template again, right? Response body, and we also add the message here, right? So that we can use that in the template to send to the view. And now, because I've said we need to use that in the template so that it's useful, so because we have a message variable now, we can go ahead and update the pug template and assign the message to the dot error, right? The buffered. Okay, update the application so it allows you to specify which location you want the details from, get the details from the API, and output them to the browser, right? Specify the ID, application route for a single location. So you have API location ID. Let's see what were the changes. Adds location ID parameter to the route for a single location. Okay, so setting URLs and routes to access specific MongoDB documents, right? So here you would see the card block. So the clue here is you have each location in location. So you know everything here pertains to just one location, right? So the location name, right, is also assigned a hyperlink that when it's clicked, it's basically gonna um, request for this route, the location and the specific location ID that's associated with that location, right? So because you got that unique ID, let's see. The next is moving the rendering into a name function, right? Um, Remember the render homepage, we now have the render detail page, right? And then calls a new function from the controller, remembering it to pass rec and requests and response parameters, right? So instead of having all the rest render here, we decoupled it, right? So the controller function only knows the render detailed page. It doesn't need to know all the content. It just knows that it needs to call this. Okay, creating the API using a unique ID from a URL parameter. Okay, so once we got the path, right, we specify the path, and we'll basically get the request params location ID from the URL, and then add that to our request option. Another word for this are the request headers, right? And then we can now add the request module, use the request module, and first parameter request response. And now the callback function doesn't need to know all the details. It just would know that it should call the render details page function. Okay, so right now you are just assuming you're returning the API is returning correct data. You'll get around to error trapping soon. This data needs a small amount of pre-processing. The coordinates are returned from the API as an array, but the view needs ... Okay, so transforming the data from the API before sending it to the render detail page function, right? So request options, error response, body. You just grab the body that you got and assign that to a variable, and you now want to basically do a data.chords and change the following, and then the body.chords with the first element and the body.chords the second element, right? So it resets the property to be an object, setting longitude and latitude using values pulled from the API response. Okay. Right. Okay, so accepts the data as a parameter and then updates the value passed through to view as required. So you now have the location dot name here and also here, right? Because you're grabbing it, your render detail page function also have the location object. So you want to trap 404 response, you can flip it on its head and look for any response that isn't 200. You can pass the status code to the show error function, figure out what to do. So you catch the 200 error status code. Then if yes, let's do this longitude latitude, right? And then once that's successful, we get the updated chords from the response body, and we can render the data page. If not, instead of creating your own error here, just call the show error function. Okay, so you can let the user what is going on with the errors, and you can also create a unique page. Remember, like the 404 page not found, you can create that page as well. And as I've said, so here we go. So when you when there's a 404, the title becomes a 404 page not found, right? Also show the status code here, right? Okay, and there you go, you would have something like this. And that's about it for this lesson, and we should be continuing in the next lesson. See you there.